Hello and welcome to our second series on the Musicking podcast.
I'm your host Trinity Lay, and today we are joined by musician, filmmaker, and professor of ethnomusicology Scott Linford. With him, we'll be taking a look at the music culture of the Jola ethnic group, located throughout areas in Senegal, the Gambia, and Guinea-Bissau, specifically focusing on the Ekonting, a three-stringed plucked gourd lute played almost exclusively by individuals from this region. Professor Linford has spent an extensive amount of time speaking and performing with, as well as learning from, Jola Ekonting musicians. He's currently working on an album project through Smithsonian Folkways featuring the music of these individuals, as well as a book containing their stories and perspectives, which will both be published in the near future, and I'll link them both when they're published, so be sure to check them out. The music in this episode is performed by Scott Linford, as well as Ekonting musician Adama Sambu, and I would like to thank them both for lending us their music and their voices.
So originally I thought that the topic of this episode was going to be the connection between the banjo and the Ekonting, because the Ekonting has been established as a likely ancestor of the banjo. And you're a banjo player, so I thought that would be an interesting exploration. But eventually, when I was looking through research on it, I realized that the Ekonting was only mentioned in reference to the banjo and in that connection to the banjo, and it wasn't explored in and of itself, other than in your work, so that inspired me to focus purely on the Ekonting. And also, bluegrass banjo is a huge topic, and Ekonting is a huge topic that you could talk for a long time about. So I thought that they both deserve their own episode, and maybe we could briefly talk about the connection, but other than that, yeah. And so it sounds like you had a sort of similar journey when it comes to coming across the Ekonting and becoming interested in it.
So yeah, I am a banjo player. I started playing banjo in college in an old-time music ensemble and learned to play clawhammer banjo. And at that time, this was in the early 2000s, I had no clue that there was anything kind of African about the banjo and its history. And I think I had sort of grown up with images of, white rural Southerners playing banjo, and that was kind of my association with it. So it was really eye-opening for me just to learn when I first started playing banjo about this African-American history of banjo playing in the U.S., and then that it had, had this African archetypes that the instrument was based on. So that was really revelatory and exciting for me. And so I started looking into it, and it was right around that time there was this event called the Black Banjo Gathering that took place in the U.S., really exploring those African-American and African history of the banjo and exploring the banjo as a black instrument. So I first actually got in contact with this man named Daniel Lemujata, and he was in the process of founding something that he's called the Ekonting Center for Senegambian Folk Music in the Gambia right around that same time too. And he presented at that event, the Black Banjo Gathering. So that was kind of my first introduction to the Ekonting. So it came through the banjo for me. And then many years later, when I was in graduate school, finally had the opportunity to go visit him in the Gambia and spent a summer there learning to play Ekonting. And I think, Trinity, I kind of had the same idea that you did, that I was going to be part of a group of people who were working on this connection between the Ekonting and then kind of early New World gourd banjos, which I still think is a really exciting area of research. And there's new stuff coming out all the time in really interesting ways. But I guess what I found when I was there is that I sort of became more interested in just the Ekonting apart from the banjo, in part because most Jolas have never really heard of the banjo before. And so it's not really a part of why they play it or why they think it's important. I'm often the first person to tell them about the banjo, and they think it's great. It's really exciting, and just see it as like an American Ekonting, basically. So that kind of connection to the banjo, it is still part of how I think about it and how I came into it. But yeah, as time went on, my interest shifted more to understanding the Ekonting in the context of just Jola life and Jola music culture more generally.
Something that I thought was really interesting when learning about the Ekonting was the sort of lore behind it and the legends and the stories that people would tell to explain where it came from, and also some warnings and how to play it. So there's the story about how maybe you shouldn't go out and play it in the forest at night because you might get stolen away, and how that was perhaps connected to records of people being taken and sold into slavery who played these spiked gourds instruments. And so there's that connection with why these instruments or types of these instruments showed up throughout the Caribbeans and the Americas. And then there is my favorite story, which was the story of the three brothers, how one played the instrument and he played it aggressively. He started shredding and he broke a string, and then another guy played it and he played it too intellectually or pretentiously, and he couldn't make it sound sweet, and he broke another string. And then the third brother, he played it and he talked about how he wanted to have a woman love him, and he played it sweetly and simply, and then that's how the instrument is played now, because then the instrument turned into a woman who's like, you're not so bad, you seem like a nice dude. And so they had a family together and became musicians, and it creates this framework for how to play and also listen to Ekonting music. Is it's not this super intellectual instrument, you're not supposed to be super virtuosic on it. I just thought that story was so interesting because it can tell you so much about the culture.
Yeah, I agree. I love that story too. That story comes from this collection of Jola folktales that was published by French ethnographer Louis Vincent Thomas. He lived in the Casamance for decades and was one of the earliest to write about the Ekonting in any level of detail. But yeah, I love that story too because you're right. It points out in all these different directions about understanding this instrument. The first part of that story is that the fourth brother, I guess it's funny, found the Ekonting just in the forest. And so just the idea that it was kind of just there waiting to be found, and the fact that it was in the forest, it sort of has this association with the natural world. And, forests are very meaningful places, especially those that are in proximity to Jola villages. So that the Ekonting kind of came from that world, and that it's made of natural materials is really significant. And then, yeah, too, I love that. I mean, it's funny, the first brother who plays it too aggressively, you kind of can imagine that. But I like, too, that then the second brother, it's like he's too, he's just being a little extra in his playing of the Ekonting. And that, too, is really kind of not acceptable. And it's the third brother who plays it sweetly and almost kindly. And it's like this indication of his own moral character in the manner that he's playing. Yeah, and as you said, I mean, in contrast to some West African instruments, the kora is one that comes to mind as like very specific repertoire, really incredible levels of virtuosity that are performed on that instrument, things like that. So in contrast to that, the Ekonting it doesn't have that kind of grand performance tradition. And it's not part of a specific social role, like for example, a jali playing a kora would be. And instead, it's just something that anybody can do. It is primarily men, but even women can play it. There's no reason they can't. So yeah, it sort of feels more like a kind of an everyday person's instrument. And it's interesting too that it's not really, I know you're a tabla player, for example, and the tabla is a very special kind of object, and you treat it in certain ways, and you have to be respectful toward it. And the Ekonting is not really like that. It's almost funny to me how people are kind of very casual with their Ekonting sometimes and just toss them on the ground or leave them leaning precariously somewhere, and they notoriously fall over all the time just because of how they're built. On my first trip, when I was in the Gambia, we got caught in this rainstorm. This was at the Ekonting Center with my first teacher, Musa Jata. We always had our lessons outside under this mango tree, and so it started pouring. At that time of year, it's just going to rain for like an hour, and then it'll stop. So we just went and hid out in this little shelter. And as time went on, the shelter started leaking and the roof was kind of starting to collapse a little bit. And so Musa just kind of like jammed his Ekonting up into the corner to like support this roof. And there's like water pouring down his instrument. I really love his Ekonting, actually, of like almost of any Ekonting. It's my favorite instrument his because it's just really has this beautiful sound he gets out of it. So I was like almost heartbroken to see this thing getting soaked by rain, and because the gourd is really fragile and the skin is going to change if it gets wet and everything. But for Musa, it's not like that. He just carries this thing around slung over his shoulder, and it's not a precious object. In part because most people build their own, and the materials to build them are not expensive, and they're easy to get a hold of. So, it's replaceable.
I thought it was interesting because one of the things that I learned about Jola culture is that there's a certain respect an importance placed on things that are super old. So the idea that the Ekonting has always been there, it's like the, not oldest object, but like it's been there forever, waiting to be found. I thought it was interesting that not as much importance is placed on the instrument. Do you have any idea of why that is?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, and it is true that, I mean, even, among people, to be an elder in Jola society confers a lot of status and authority. And it was funny, actually, last time I went to Senegal, my dad came with me. And my dad has really lovely white hair and a big white beard. And so he was just like, it's a sign of elderdom. And he really got a lot of respect. And I think even me, I got a little extra respect just for being associated with this guy. Yeah, the idea of things being old is something that confers respect and authority and power. I've been curious about the history of the Ekonting, and there are some oral histories that it may have been created in kind of the Western Casamance region. Other people have told me it came from the south, from Guinea-Bissau, and was inspired by like a really similar instrument played by an ethnic group called the Balanta. So there are some kind of historical ideas that people have about it, but a lot of people also have told me just like, no one made this instrument. It's just always been here. And so to me, yeah, that is a kind of a mark of status and importance. It's ancient. But you're right, there's an interesting contrast with that, and then the fact that people are really casual about these instruments, and they just seem to kind of come and go. And yeah, so that's an interesting contrast. I'm going to have to think more about that.
So what are the contexts that the Ekonting is performed in? Because it's a very mellow-sounding instrument. You can't play it over lots of drums or horns or a big group of people singing.
Yeah, great question. So there are several venues or contexts in which it's performed. And you're right, it's very quiet. It's not a loud instrument. And so a lot of Jola music takes place in kind of large social gatherings. There are sometimes really big drums that are played. There's often a lot of people singing, sometimes, idiophones, bamboo clappers especially. Nowadays people play saxophone sometimes too. And so it's just a loud, exciting event, a big kind of Jola music event. And so the Ekonting doesn't really work that well in that context because it's just not audible. Kind of is associated with a couple of different things. So one of the big ones is wrestling matches, which that's like the sport of choice for Jolas. And it's great. I mean, in a way, it feels like going to a high school football game or something like that, going to a Jola wrestling match. People sit in a big ring, and it's really fun and celebratory. And there's a specific kind of music style, Ekonting, that's associated with wrestling matches, and this drumming style and dancing style and all this kind of stuff. So people don't really play Ekonting during the event, but they play it really before and after. You get your buddy and you're on the way there, and you sort of have this like your guys and
Your hype man.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and so the Ekonting is kind of hyping people up, and wrestling songs, that's kind of a specific genre. It uses a lot of vocables, and so it's really easy to sing along with. And the lyrics tend to be like super short about whoever the wrestler is that's hyping up, and there'll just be one word. It's like his back never touches the ground. That'll be the only lyric, like he never gets pinned, and then everything else is vocable. So it's this really great, exciting event, and the Ekonting works in that context. And then people play them after the event too, the Ekontings. And yes, someone was telling me that if you win, then it's like this really celebratory thing, and the Ekonting heightens your enthusiasm and sense of victory. And if you lose, then it sort of consoles you a little bit. Mm-hmm. So it kind of plays these different roles. Another important context where it, as you alluded to, is in courtship. It is mainly played by men, and mainly young men, actually. It's really associated with youth. That's kind of another interesting element of the age thing. People do play it sometimes as they get older, but it's, I think, really seen as a young person's instrument. In part because of the association with wrestling, which is also a kind of a young person's thing to do, and in part because of the courtship. And it plays a similar role in the context of courtship, where again, if you were kind of working yourself up maybe to go ask somebody out, you'd need your people with you.
Going into battle in a different way.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. You need some musical courage, And so the Ekonting plays that role, getting your courage up to go participate in like a kind of a dating dance, a dating event. And then, too, it can be part of courtship where a young man would play a song about a young woman, about how great she is and how beautiful she is. And that would be kind of part of establishing courtship in that way, too. I'd say probably the third most important context just in kind of traditional life is just real kind of casual use, especially like after you've been out working in the rice fields all day, which is what most jolas do. They're rice farmers, and it's really physically laborious labor. And so at the end of the day, you might just find a shady spot and sit with your friends and have a clay pot or a gourd of bunuk, of palm wine, just as the sun's kind of going down. And you might even take turns kind of passing the Ekonting around and singing songs. So it's those kind of smaller, quieter occasions that are most appropriate for the Ekonting.
And that lines up with the original legend where it's like, it's supposed to be played simply and sweetly and something everybody can participate in. So that makes a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm.
I thought it was really enjoyable to read the stories about how groups of men would go to a different community and then play for the girls. And then the guys in that community would come and be like, don't steal our girls. And then they'd take out these machetes and hit them on the back of the head with like the dole end in some sort of faux battle. But it's interesting, the juxtaposition of this sweet instrument and this charming sound and simplicity. And then you mentioned in class one time about Ekonting battles.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I've never witnessed this. I have always wanted to. Mm-hmm. And I hope that someday I will have a good fortune. But yeah, a couple of people have told me about this, that either in the context of a wrestling match or, like you're saying, in these kind of ritual fighting scenarios that happen in late night young people's dances, that you can have Ekonting duels. So after a wrestling match, for example, if the Ekonting players from the different neighborhoods or maybe the different villages that the two wrestlers came from, they'll kind of have a duel, like an Ekonting off. And I don't know how the victor is decided, but whoever wins, it's like really a lot of prestige. And then whoever loses the Ekonting battle, the winner gets to smash their Ekonting to bits, which I think would be really rewarding because the gourd is pretty fragile. And so I think it would break in a spectacular fashion to really smash an Ekonting. Which, again, that sort of indicates that these aren't really like precious instruments. You're not going to do that to somebody. There's something you can make yourself, and it takes a week or something like that.
And you said that during the wrestling matches, the Ekonting player will sing songs to hype up the person that they're with. But is there ever like diss tracks for the opposite team?
That's a good question. Are there Ekonting diss tracks? I can only really think of one that it's not really in the context of wrestling, but were these competitions between folkloric groups, and I can think of only one song where they're sort of trash talking another one of the groups. Yeah, and then it's funny. I'm thinking now of another wrestling song, and there's this line in it. Actually, the words "die here" is the line, and it's kind of like the idea is like, yeah, you might sort of talk trash, but that's where it ends. Like it doesn't go any further than that. And after the end of the match, everybody's friends again.
Yeah, that was another thing. When the men from one group would go over to woo the ladies of another community, and then they'd get into fight with the people or the men from that community because they're trying to protect their ladies, and they'd all be friends afterwards. They'd all kind of laugh about it and joke about it because it's not a big, serious thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. It almost reminds me of like some of the ways that people have talked about early hip hop in the Bronx, of like dance offs and DJ offs and things like that become this way, almost like a kind of a ritualized competition that in a way actually prevents like actual physical violence. You can almost see the kind of ritual nature of the fighting that takes place, and it's always very clear that you're not really intending to actually physically hurt anybody.
Thank you for tuning into today's episode, which is part 1 of our 3-part series on the Jola Ekonting. Today we introduced some of the lore, history, and context of performance for Ekonting music, which has an interesting juxtaposition of being used in courtship and peaceful gatherings after work and requiring the players to have a sweet tone, and then being used in more rowdy settings like during wrestling matches and playoffs. In the next episode, we'll talk more about the music and the performance practice and theory of Ekonting playing. Please visit our website, musicingpod.com, and follow us on social media at musicingpod to learn more and stay updated. And we hope to see you in the next episode.